Let's go. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The answer is bishop to a6. Queen to f5. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes bishop. c7, check. Bishop takes pawn. Rook to e8, check. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to c8. Bishop takes queen. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes knight. There are no checks in this position. The answer is knight to e4. Queen to e7. Queen takes knight. Queen to b4, check. Knight to d2. d5. a3. Queen to c5. Queen takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Knight takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: knight to f3, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: knight takes pawn, check. King to f1. Knight to g4. g3. Rook takes pawn, check. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: there are no threats in this position. The checks are: rook to f5, check. Rook to h4, check. g4, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to h4, check. King to g5. Bishop to c3. Queen to e2. Rook to e1. Queen takes rook, check. Bishop takes queen. Next puzzle. Threats in this position are: queen takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes pawn. Queen to a3. King to g8. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. The checks are: queen to f7, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen to h7, check. Knight to f6, check. Knight takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using: queen to g6. King to h8. Knight to e5. One more. Here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Checks in this position are: rook to f3, check. Rook to e1, check. Rook to g3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn. Knight to h2. Rook to e1, check. Bishop to e2. Rook takes pawn, check. King to f4. Rook takes bishop. Knight to f3. Bishop takes knight. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. King takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: king takes bishop. Knight to f7. c5. Knight to h6. c6. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Checks in puzzle position are: queen to e3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to c3, check. Queen to b4, check. Queen to a5, check. Rook takes rook, check. The best move in puzzle position is: queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen to c4, check. Next puzzle. Threats in this position are: rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop to a7, check. Bishop to c7, check. Queen to g8, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to d1. Knight to d5. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen to e2. Queen to b6. Queen to f3. Rook to b1. King to h3. Let's continue. Threats in this position are: queen takes rook. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn, check. King to f1. Rook to c2. Bishop to h3. Rook takes bishop. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using king to e4. b4. h4. h5. Pawn takes pawn. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to c8, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to b1. Rook takes queen. Pawn takes rook. King to f7. Rook to a8. Queen takes pawn. Promotes to queen. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to d3, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h5, check. The best move in puzzle position is knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. King to h7. Knight to e4. Knight to g6. Knight to g5, check. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is h3. Queen to e8. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. e6. Queen takes pawn. e7. Next puzzle, the threats are rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Rook to g8, check. Queen to e6, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to f6, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes bishop. Bishop to e6. Bishop takes bishop. One more. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are knight to f3, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. d6. Knight to f3. Knight takes knight, check. One more. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes pawn, check. King to a8. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Queen to h5. Rook to g5. Queen to h4. Next puzzle, the threats are queen takes queen, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are queen to d2, check. Queen takes queen, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes queen, check. Rook takes queen. Knight to c6. Bishop to c4, check. King to g6. Next puzzle, the threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h4. King to d5. c4, check. King to d4. King to b4. g5. Pawn takes pawn. h4. Pawn takes pawn. Next puzzle, the threats are bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is king to c8. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. g3. Bishop to g4. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Rook takes bishop. The checks are queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight to c6. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. Queen to f5. Rook takes bishop. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is e5, g5 check, king to g4, pawn takes pawn, king to f3. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to g3 check, queen to g2 check, queen to g1 check. The answer is queen to g2 check, king to e3, bishop to h5. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.